continuing chapter 4 of part 7. Of late years, examination of his character, his motives, and his conduct has gone far to mitigate the verdict of the past. Every examination of the career of Jesus involves an examination of the case of Judas, and the very unanimity of opinion in past ages has so aroused the suspicion of modern criticism that some writers who have not concerned themselves with Jesus have found a fascination in the unique historical position of Judas, attracting them to an analysis of his natural characteristics and of his motives in this most unfortunate and fatal betrayal of his teacher. The German critics first suggested that the story of Judas had been misread and the man misunderstood, that appearances were so frightfully against him at the first as to put him under a cloud, which his sudden death quickly following his betrayal of Jesus prevented him from dissipating, and which no one subsequently had any interest in removing, while partisanship for Jesus gave his followers a reason for making that cloud as dark as possible. De Quincey sums up the reasonings of the Germans along this line of thought with suggestions of his own, the amount of which is that Judas was not in the bad sense a traitor, that his movements during the Passover week were not intended to crush, nay, nor even to retard, but rather to advance the cause of Jesus. He may have had some self-seeking in all that he did, but not base treachery and certainly not petty avarice. His reasoning was fallacious, as subsequent events have shown, but it was just such as an average intellect would have pursued before the catastrophe, in view of such facts as are now known to have been before the mind of Judas, and specially operative upon such a mental and moral constitution as that of Judas. Quite lately this theory has been taken up by Mr. Story, an American sculptor residing in Rome, and worked into a poem of considerable dramatic force entitled The Roman Lawyer in Jerusalem, first published in Blackwood, and afterward in a small volume. In this poem, the theory is such an advance on that of the Germans and De Quincey as to make Judas, upon the whole, the very best and noblest of the 12 apostles, most believing, most daring, most delicate. Of all the apostles, he was the only who so believed in the godhood of Jesus that he felt no power could kill him, and if he could put his master in such relation to human power that he would be compelled to let his godhood break through his humanity, then should be brought to pass what they all desired. Well, again, if you go back and put words in people's mouths and beliefs in people's mouths which they didn't express, then, such conclusions, that's not the only option of that sort of idea, right? The immediate inauguration of the Messianic kingdom, it might be a personal disaster to Judas to do it, but none of the other disciples had the faith in Jesus and the daring to make the venture. Judas had. But when he saw his dire mistake, that Jesus did not burst out into undeniable messianic splendor and power, Judas was so delicately constituted that his heart broke. This is the argument of Mr. Story's poem. Let us see how much of all this has ground in history and reason. Jesus originally selected Judas from a company of at least 60 of his followers to be of the number of the 12 who should be on his staff and should be charged with the special duty of propagating his doctrines. Judas, then, was no worse and no better than the rest of them. He was an average man of average moral and intellectual endowments, but he was drawn to Jesus, and by Jesus selected to the apostolate. He was religious above the average. Through his whole connection with Jesus, up to this point, he does nothing and says nothing which draws a reproof from Jesus. He behaves better than the rest. He never had said or done anything to make Jesus say to him, as he had to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." He was a better tempered man than John, who is the admiration of painters and romancers, for never like John had he desired to call down fire from heaven to consume his fellow men. He never was such a profane liar as Peter proved to be, nor so ambitious as John and his brother James, who desired to share the Messianic kingdom with Jesus and sit one on his right hand and the other on his left, ruling over their brethren. The only occasion when even acuteness can discover anything that can be tortured into a reproof is the supper in the house of Simon the leper, when Judas suggested that the money which had been spent on the ointment by Mary might have been better expended on the poor. If any candid reader will forget that it was Judas who made this remark, and notice that what Jesus said was not in opposition to the remark of Judas, a remark which Judas himself had learned from the very teaching of Jesus. If the reader will only fancy that John might have said the same thing and Jesus might have made to him the same reply, then all sign of reproof will disappear. It is to be recollected by those who will be critical that when we read the account of that supper in John's 12th chapter, we are prejudiced by the statement that it was Judas Iscariot who made the suggestion of economy in the matter of the ointment, and that John takes pains to inform us that it was he which should betray him. And then it adds the damaging parentheses. Well, parentheses, comma, a lot of that stuff isn't literally in the Bible. It's stuff that's put in later versions of the Bible. But this he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag and bore what was put therein. If we had only the narratives of Matthew and Mark, we could never have had any suspicion that Jesus was reproving the suggestion of giving the money to the poor, but was rather with his usual lofty yet tender courtesy, protecting the woman who loved him and was anointing him. It is to be considered then that John saying he was a thief does not prove that Judas had ever committed an act of theft or showed any signs of proclivity towards peculation. He certainly had not been a thief up to the time of his election for the apostolate. He was a man of executive ability surpassing them all, and supported to be a man of honesty equal to them all, else he had not been made their treasurer. But they had an insignificant exchequer is not proof that they would therefore be careless as to the person who should manage it. Quite the contrary. Poor people who invest their savings a dime at a time need to be more careful than men who would not be embarrassed for an hour by the breaking of a bank in which they have deposited $10,000. These disciples were scrupulous and careful. There must have been frequent auditing of the accounts of Judas, not from any suspicion of foul dealing on his part, but to know how far their little fund would meet their pressing wants. A widow whose toil brings such weekly wages as that, the most rigid economy must be exercised to keep her outgo from exceeding her income, counts over her little store more frequently and carefully than the Rothschilds count their ample assets. Well, there's more ruling families but the Rothschilds have remained one of the ruling families. The disciples would have detected the leakage if Judas had purloined. Jesus would have found some method of reproof, or at least of warning, but nothing of this kind ever occurred. No suspicion against Judas arose among the disciples until after the betrayal of Jesus. John wrote this verdict after Judas had betrayed Jesus. The other disciples must have been unspeakably outraged. It was natural. They would not have deserved to be the friends of Jesus if they had not felt the utmost horror at the betrayal. That would naturally lead them to believe any evil thing of the betrayer, and as Judas certainly did receive money for his services in this transaction, it was most natural to suppose that he was so avaricious that he would have stolen, that he who would sell his master for, so they regarded it, for 30 shekels, the price of a slave, would not hesitate to steal, being at heart a thief, and that he who had not tenderness enough for such a master as Jesus, as to make the earth, even if it were a solid chrysolite, no temptation, as a bribe for betrayal, could not have had any care for the poor. This is all that the words of John do really prove, namely that his fellow apostle regarded the act of Judas as so horrible as to put him beyond the pale of Christian charity, in which they might have been as much mistaken as John was when he wanted fire from heaven to burn up the Samaritan village. And remember that the Gospel of John was written, in the 90s. There was conflict with the Jews and the Christians at that point. That was reaching a particular thing, and the Christians sort of felt threatened by the Jews. So Judas had the worldly part of the work of the apostles to attend to. He made the little purchases, and thus, De Quincey suggests, came in contact with the petty shopkeepers, or, as I should say, mingled with that class from whom he gathered the popular opinion of men and measures. He was not confined to the spiritual influence of the inner circle of the friends of Jesus. He went out frequently into the world, and coming back to Judas, believed, as they all did, that Jesus was going to establish a temporal kingdom. The difference between the 11 and Judas, as it seems to me, was simply this, that theirs was a vague belief and expectation influencing them more as a dream than as a vital power shaping their lives. Judas was no fanatic and no poet. He was no fanatic and no poet. I think Mr. Story not quite right when he speaks of him as a man who took his dreams for firm realities. Well, our dreams and visions, even if it is just our psychological workings, they're a type of reality. He studied all the phenomena of the case. As a man of affairs, as an astute politician, he had more knowledge of the world and more practical sense than the other apostles. He believed in the desirableness of throwing off the Roman yoke. He believed the time had come to do it. The people had grown into an impatience that was passionate. If a proper leader could be found at a proper time to strike, the work could be accomplished. He found that leader in Jesus. It would seem probable that more than the other apostles he believed in the messiahship of Jesus, and in a loftier and, at the same time, more practical way. Let us suppose that he brooded over this thought for 3 years, not as a dreamer, but as a practical working man. He would naturally come to see it in a light in which the other apostles could not study it. The capacities of Jesus for such a leadership would be a question of profound interest. He saw in him prodigious power to work miracles, to escape through the heart of a mob. As he bore a charmed life, he was capable of overawing men. A crowd of merchants had rushed out of the temple before his eyes of rebuke. There was a majestic augustness about him, which made Judas feel that this was a king of men. Devils bowed before him, while children were attracted to his side and were petted when they came, and women absolutely adored him to the very kissing of his feet. He could raise the dead with a word. Could he not slay the wicked with a look? Jesus had all the personal dignities and graces for a king of kings, but there was one defect. He had no policy and no push. So it must have seemed to Judas, Jesus never took advantage of his personal popularity to consolidate a party. He fed thousands of people and got nothing back. He confounded the ecclesiastical leaders, and yet would not found a church. Well, a sect, you could say, would be a better way to put that. But and now when his affairs seemed to be reaching a crisis, he was making no movements, ecclesiastical or political. This behavior in the eyes of a politician was simply absurd. Judas, no more than the other apostles, recognized the interiorness and thoroughness of the kingdom, which Jesus was preaching and trying to make them understand. How that it was like that ether which pervades the atmosphere and glass and all transparent substances, and is where there is neither air nor glass, a kingdom which did not need to displace any existing kingdom of church, a kingdom which could as well subsist in political anarchies as in empires, in republics as in despotisms, a kingdom which had no need of any outward and visible state or any outward and visible church, but could and would subsist in all forms of states and all forms of church, and without all states and all churches, a kingdom which did not exist but subsist and persist, that did not stand out but fill through, that was not a phenomenon but a noumenon, rooted and grounded in the belief that a temporal, sensuous, visible Hebrew kingdom was to cover the earth and subdue the nations. Nothing else would satisfy Judas. And he must have believed that Jesus expected such a kingdom, and expected to reign over it, but that he had not the promptness at the right moment to make the stroke, the requisite coup d'etat, how do you pronounce that? But if you look at the Zionism of Tanakh, it's actually, you step aside from that blood and soil stuff. So it's not about the ancestry and it's not about the land so much, although, you can have the temple is important and all that. But, in De Quincey's language, he seemed to Judas to be sublimely overgifted for purposes of speculation, but not commensurately endowed for the business of action and the sudden emergencies of life. And to Judas the conduct of his brother apostles, and of all the followers of Jesus, was most unwise and unprofitable. They needed all their funds, and yet were wasting it on ointment. The apostles and the other friends of Jesus were doing nothing for him, simply enjoying his society, walking about with him, behaving like children. It must have chafed Judas. And although he made no special profession of attachment to Jesus, and received no discriminating attention from him, Judas may have felt at heart that he was doing more for the cause than they all, or at least had the most earnest desire to do so. Over these things he had been brooding for months, if not years. Now the crisis was coming. Jesus himself seemed to be abandoning the messianic work on which he had entered. It behooves us to consider every element which may have entered into the calculations of Judas. At this juncture of affairs, he may have reviewed his reasonings and seen things in this position. He may have been right as to the claims of Jesus to the Messiahship, or had been wrong. The established church and government had some claims upon Judas. The church was the enemy of Jesus. The church desired to suppress Jesus privately. Judas could argue with the clergy to point out Jesus at night quietly. Then one of the two things would occur. Jesus would raise the populace and proceed to carry the revolution forward with vigor, or else he was an impostor, and it was right that he should be surrendered. This last thought, I think, could have been, at most, only a side light on the mind of Judas. He could hardly have suspected Jesus of being an impostor, but in such case as this, a man is actuated by many and sometimes contradictory motives. But I agree with Neander that avarice could scarcely have been a leading motive for the case of Judas. If he were avaricious and treacherous at heart, why, after receiving the money from the priests, did he point out Jesus? There was nothing more to be gained, and it was not so offensive a thing to cheat the malignant priests as to betray his good master. He kept his contract, showing that he was not treacherous, and he returned the money when he saw that he was wrong. All that he did and act was to designate Jesus in a crowd at night. Let us consider the circumstances of his remorse and death, not forgetting the truth of Neander's remark. As a general thing, the impressions made upon a man by the results of his action testify but little as to his character and motives. None can tell how an evil deed, even when deliberately planned and perpetuated, will react upon the conscience. Which is why, in some ways, we should do away with hate crimes and stuff like this, and just address the actual crime. Someone commits a heinous crime, but they can't find the hate crime motivation, so they don't get the time of somebody committing a much lesser crime, but they find a hate crime motivation. Mark, Luke, and John are silent. Matthew and the writer of the Acts of the Apostles are our only authorities. Now, I forget. One of the Gospels was written by the same person who wrote the book of Acts, and that was in the 120s. And it was the second of the Gospels. The former says, in 28:3 that when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he returned the money to the priests and acknowledged that he had betrayed innocent blood, and then went out and hanged himself. In the Acts 1:16, Peter, who had acted very basely at the betrayal of Jesus, is represented as saying that Judas had purchased a field with the wages of iniquity, and falling on his face, he burst asunder, and all his bowels gushed forth. It is plain that both these accounts cannot be accurate. If he returned the money, then he did not buy a field with it. If he hanged himself, he did not meet with the horrible end depicted by Peter. Casaubon, is that the guy who criticizes John Dee? A True and Faithful Relation by Merritt Casaubon. This could be, because that's now it's the most famous Casaubon, but according to Matthew, Judas hanged himself, and that he did this over the valley of Gehenna. The branch broke, or the rope was torn, and Judas, according to Peter, fell headlong and burst asunder. This seems ridiculous, and yet there does not seem to be any better theory. And taken literally, the accounts are contradictory, and one or the other was mistaken. Well, the Bible has up to 8 opinions on any particular matter. Usually completely agrees and there's not a conflict, but, particularly when we get into the Christian side, there's conflicts that you can't group together, Peter's speech is evidently loosely rhetorical. There must have been other facts of which we have no knowledge and which might reconcile these statements. We are to remember the rooted belief among the apostles and their countrymen that every marked physical evil was retributive of the individual's sins. It must needs be that they should suppose that Judas should have something horrible in his death. It is quite clear that he did come to some tragic end, and when he saw what he had done, when he beheld Jesus with such placidity submitting himself to the hands of the church and the state for execution, all at once there rolled back upon him the tide of his earliest affection for Jesus, the remembrance of all the beautiful and beneficent life of Jesus, a perception of his own huge and irredeemable blunder, and he rushed to the hierarchy and flung their money back to them, and went out appalled, horror-stricken, heartbroken, strangling with his emotions, and fell down dead. This figurative rendering seems to be the only reasonable method of harmonizing the two accounts. We are not to apologize for Judas, nor add unwarrantably to his badness, but strive to find out what he was. He was an average politician. He was audacious rather than treacherous. He believed that the cause of Jesus needed the hand of policy to steady it and push it forward. He dared to take out of the hand of the master what was the work of the master, and he perished in the attempt. His ruin was caused by the impatience and pride of his utter worldliness, but for his impatient policy he never would have consulted with the church party. But for his impatient pride he would have led a life of penitence which would have restored him. It was through his worldliness and not through his sagacity that the devil entered into him. Peter did quite as basely as he, but Peter repented and lived to recover himself. If societal damage had not seemed to the worldliness of Judas the greatest of all evils, repentance might have brought recovery to him as it did to Peter. The 4th day of the week began on Tuesday evening and closed on Wednesday evening. On Tuesday evening, Judas probably had his interval with the church authorities. Then Jesus went with his disciples to Bethany. The temporary absence of Judas would have scarcely been noticed by the other disciples, as he must have been accustomed to be absent in his attendance on the temporalities of the body. History is silent on this Wednesday, April 5th, the year 30. There is not an intimation of any movement on the part of the authorities or of Jesus. He seems to have gone into profound retirement. There is no notice of any communication even with his disciples. It is a strange calm stealing in between the commotion of the preceding and the storm of the succeeding days. Jesus evidently felt his position and knew all that was going forward. We may fancy the thoughts and feelings of such a head and such a heart as his, but there is no history. Now, there's a lot of backdating of myths, like it was written by somebody who knew the person or whatever. So that's largely what they do, or a lot of it's not in the text itself. It's just, the doctrine, oh, these are the accounts. And it's like, but we find out they're hundreds of years later or dozens of years later or something, 3 generations on, competing movements that were after Jesus had died out and, got blended into it. And,